Hello, everyone. I think we're just starting today's disability filibuster. We just start a little bit slowly and give people a chance to join. It's just 12 now, but I just wanted to say hello to people who are here and thank you for joining us today. Thank you for supporting the disability filibuster. We'll just give it a moment to make sure that we have everyone who's joining. I don't know, Luna, if you have a few words to say while we're just giving people some time to join.
Yeah. I feel like I can say so many things. I feel like I can say so many things, but what I really want to say is, yeah, welcome to the space, everyone, and welcome and make yourselves comfortable. One of the things when coming into a session, I'm both been a participant and also a very active facilitator, is that I cannot keep saying enough to people: drink water, eat snacks, go to the washroom when you need to. I am not that important. Your body is the most important. So I just want to say to folks, I come here with a lot of love and care today for you, and for those who are listening, for those who are presenting. It is an unfortunate circumstance for us to come here together. And at the same time, I'm also feeling a little bit of sunshine because I'm connected to this, because I get to see your faces, because I get to hear from you. And I think that regardless of how we are being brought together, we are being brought together, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I just want to kind of start with that. And Spring, if we're ready to go, maybe I'll leave it back to you to open us up, introduce things. And if not, maybe we can sit in a little moment of silence as we gather the parts of our bodies and our mind and our hearts. Because when you are disabled, sometimes we disassociate when we talk about disability, when we talk about hard things. So if you need some time to just kind of like, stay here for a second, do that. Yeah. Spring, are we ready to go?
I am. My apologies. I think they were testing the fire alarm and it just went off suddenly. So I had to turn it on mute, but I hope that they're done. And if it goes out again, I will put it back on mute, and because you don't want to hear that. So thank you very much, Luna, for those really wise words. I'm very grateful to be meeting you for the first time today, and it's been a lovely experience to meet you so far. So I think we can start now. It's a few minutes after 12, so I hope that everyone who's joining us has had an opportunity to join into our Zoom meeting or to join us on YouTube. My name is Spring Hawes. I'm a disabled woman. I live in the city of Kelowna in the unceded territories of the Silks people in the province that is colonially known as British Columbia. And I'm here today to co-host with Luna this edition of the Disability Filibuster. And I think most of the people who are joining today will be familiar with the Disability Filibuster as an exercise in resistance to Bill C-7 and medically assisted dying that is specifically, I guess, targeting disabled people. And of course, as a community, disabled people have expressed a lot of concerns, reasons why that is a dangerous precedent and a dangerous law for us in Canada. So about a year and a half ago, I think, is when disability filibuster first started, and that was before Bill C-7 was passed. And there was many people who joined to bring attention to this bill that was going through the Senate and the Parliament, and to express resistance and objection to it. And it passed anyways. I believe it was in February of 2021. Bill C7 became a law. So it is now a law in Canada, and we're still resisting as a community of disabled people. What's happening now, and why the disability filibuster has started up again, is because there was a sunset clause which was included in Bill C7 when it went through and became law. And that was a sunset clause to allow for the application of MAID for people with mental illness and for advanced directives. There's also a contemplation of extending MAID to mature minors, which is really, we're talking about disabled children. So there's a committee formed in Parliament now that's reviewing this clause and seeking feedback, or, you know, has been tasked with seeking feedback from Canadians. And so Disability Filibuster, which is Gabrielle Peters and Catherine Frazee as the main organizers and the co-founders of the group, decided that it was an important time to renew Disability Filibuster and to bring people together, disabled people together, to talk about this progression and to again resist and share our position and our concern with the community. And really, it's an act of resistance. We want to be seen, we want to be heard as opposing this dangerous legislation. So I want to say thank you very much for all of the work that Gabrielle and Catherine have done in forming the Disability Filibuster, in bringing everyone together, in organizing it, in arranging for having interpreters, for spreading the word, for building a community. I think as disabled people in Canada, we will forever be in their debt. And so I want to say a special thank you to them for all of the work that they've done and for bringing us all together here. I guess I'll just give a brief introduction of myself. I'm a white woman. I have short dark hair. I'm sitting in a room which has a shelf behind me with a bunch of random things on it. I'm wearing a pink top. As I said, I live in Kelowna on the unceded territory of the Silks people, and I am just a person who cares deeply about disability and disabled people. I think a lot about ableism, and that's why I'm here today to sort of introduce that as a topic and a subject, and to help to guide a conversation with our amazing panelists, to have a deeper conversation about ableism and how MAID in the context of an ableist society is specifically dangerous to disabled people. I have done various work in the community over the years as someone who has always been asking and driving and working for more equality and for women, for disabled people, for any of the marginalized communities in our country. And so that's my sort of very vague and brief background, but that's why I'm here today. And I would like, recording in progress. I would like to pass over, now that I've introduced myself, to Luna, who is our co-host today, for their introduction.
Thank you, Spring. I'm going to start my introduction with an ancestral introduction that's in Teochew, which is an ancestral language that comes from a place called Shuatao in China. And the peoples of China, of Shuatao, originally were from what was called Middle Earth. If you know Lord of the Rings, it's Middle Earth. And we moved from Middle Earth all the way to the coast. Went from our agricultural people to coastal peoples. So I'm very, very happy to be here. So, 大家好，我名叫做Aixin，我出世地方是新加坡，我是一个混血人，我来这边上少买20年了，这地方对我来讲是死才重要，今日冇真正重要，所以我真感谢今日会使甲恁人做一 disability filibuster，所以I 上论人真多爱。So hi everyone, I hope you're well. My name is Luna Aixin, and it translates to Moon, Love, and Hearts. I was born in Singapore. It was one of my birthplaces, but I'm a multiracial person with roots, ancestral roots that goes back to parts of China and a place called Shuatao, where my peoples are known as Teochew peoples. And we were originally from what is called the Middle Earth of China, and then we moved all the way out to the east and became coastal peoples. So we went from eating a lot of meat to eating a lot of fish. So I love fish. And so these lands are perfect for me. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge and honor the first peoples of these lands, namely the unceded, stolen ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I have been a settler here for about 20 years, and I'm grateful to these lands and her peoples. Without these lands, without knowing indigenous cultures and nations, I would have never learned about my own country's colonial histories, of which I continue to learn what it means to decolonize while being a body that has lived on multiple lands that have been colonized by the same peoples. So I'll bring a little bit of the energy in there and give you a little bit of a background of who I am. So as I said, my cultural ancestors, we belong to the Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders diaspora and found ourselves in an island country called Singapore. And Singapore is not a part of China. I get that a lot, but it's not part of China. It is a small country that sits at the sort of southern tip of the Malaysian archipelago. And it is a small country that was colonized by the British in the 1800s and then by the Japanese during World War II in 1945. Prior to contact with what we call the Angmos, which are rear bearded white peoples, what our peoples call them, Singapore was actually known as Temasek and consisted of a lot of indigenous peoples, namely the Orang Lauts, the Orang Seletas, the Nusantaras, which is also one of my ancestries, the Bugis, also one of my ancestries, just to name a few. And prior to colonization, this small island was actually a thriving trading hub. And of course, when the British came, they thought that it was just a very sleepy fishing village, but we were not. Traders from everywhere around Southeast Asia were trading very actively. And just to put this into perspective, the PM, Justin Trudeau, his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of 5 generations was the first person that ruled my birth country. So I had moved and from being birthed onto a land of being colonized to being here, also lands that have been colonized by the same family. So just to put that into perspective. As an uninvited settler that was birthed into colonized cultures that have embraced Western colonization, adopting swift sort of adoptions of free market capitalism and really toxic white supremacy culture, I have witnessed and experienced the systemic internalization of white supremacy, of ableism, of racism, and a lot of these sort of harmful impacts of cultural and language loss so that I can assimilate into a world dominated by white ableist and Western thoughts and ways of being. And I actively reject that, which is sort of where my work in decolonization really happens. To describe myself, I am multiple disabled. I'm a survivor of racial and sexual violence. I'm a suicide survivor. I'm a neuro non-typical person. And I have been living here on these lands as a solo settler with no family support for almost 20 years. And I'm also a non-binary person and uses they, them pronouns. And I just want to say, for today's session, really want to say that the lands is still here. The first peoples are still here. I am still here. We are still here. And with that, I really want to thank Gabrielle for inviting me to be here, to share space with all of you and to co-host this with Spring, because I feel really honored that we are talking about something this difficult, and I really hope to be able to contribute to your well-being today. So before I continue on, because I really want to have our presenters introduce themselves, I want to say that this is a virtual session. And as someone who's done a lot of virtual sessions, I like to tell people that let's just normalize the awkwardness of being virtual. We're here kind of like in split body mode, you know, because we're not in person. And as someone who's disabled, it's sometimes and oftentimes very challenging to be in virtual spaces because I feel like I always have to collect all the pieces of myself that does not want to be in a virtual space. So I want to normalize that. In this session, we will have something called Crip space and time, where things don't function in neurotypical ways. And I'll just invite you to enjoy that. And lastly, one thing for the presenters, to really make this session more accessible, there's one request for folks to use the words "and comment," ENDCOMNENT, when you finish talking so the next speaker knows how to go. So finally, I should really introduce myself visually. So I'm a mixed race person. I'm wearing a turquoise top. I have these awesome sort of pink, multicolored earrings from someone called Only Chow Handicrafts. You should really look them up. They're awesome, based on Salt Spring. And I'm sitting in a room where there's a white curtain behind me, and I have big windows, and my cat's condo is stuck on the window behind me, but my cat is not here because my cat is sitting somewhere else. And there's a plant that's hanging on. I don't know what plant this is, but it's something that kind of swoops from the pot like hair. So yeah, so that's my introduction. And I now like to turn it over to our beloved presenters to introduce themselves. And we'll start with Spring, who will do an introduction of Carly for us to go start. So thank you so much. Spring is yours.
Thank you, Luna. That was such an interesting history, and like the context of your ancestry is really interesting. So thank you for that. So we will go around to introduce our panelists. Today we have 3 panelists along with Luna and myself. And we'll start with Carl. Pardon me, I don't think Carly's actually here, so maybe we don't. Start with Carly. So we can go along to Sunny. Sunny, would you like to start?
Sure, sure, I can do that. Hi, everyone. It's a really huge honor to be here with all of you. My name is Sunny. I use they and she pronouns, and I am joining from the stolen and settled lands of the Musqueam and the Tsawwassen people out here in what's colonially known as BC. And I am an Asian person with pale skin, long black hair, with bangs. I'm wearing circular glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a wooden door and a set of black drawers. Did I miss anything? Okay.
You know what? Would you like to tell us what you would spray paint on once you've introduced yourself, what you'd spray paint on Parliament?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I would just go for the very straightforward murderers. That's what I'd spray paint on Parliament if given the chance. Thank you so much, and comment.
Thank you for joining us today, Sunny. I'm really looking forward to all of our conversation. So we will ask Shea if you can introduce yourself, please, next, Shea.
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Shea Ehrlich. I am a non-binary white trans mask appearing human Currently, I am wearing big dark blue headphones, a black tank top, and a neon green binder that is visible outside of the edges. I also have very short brown hair that is very tight on the sides and longer on top, and a nose piercing and an eyebrow piercing. All the things. It's fun. I am taking this call in my office, and you'll see behind me in my background that I have a Progress Pride flag and a couple of pink flower lights. There's also a somewhat on angle snake plant in the background, somewhat on top of my filing cabinet, hidden behind a stack of papers that need to make their way into the filing cabinet. I'm coming and participating with you all today from Takaranto, or Treaty 13 territory, which is the ancestral homelands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. And if I could spray paint anything on Parliament, the thing that's been going through my mind lately is that disabled people have a right to life, and not just to live, but have a life. That's the end of my thought.
Thank you so much, Shea. Alan, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Spring. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Hey everyone, my name is Alan Mankiewicz. I'm a white male wheelchair user. I have glasses and short hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, and I'm on a Zoom background that's blurred out. I'm calling in from the office today. Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Winnipeg is Winnipeg is located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I use he, him pronouns, and what I would spray paint on Parliament is fuck ableism. And yeah, just really happy to be here. Happy this space was created. Grateful to Gabrielle and Spring and Catherine and everyone else who, who's made this space and invited us to participate and comment.
Thanks so much, Alan. Really appreciate that. I forgot to say what I would spray paint on Parliament, so I'm going to tell you. I just would probably spray paint Nothing About Us Without Us, which is, I know, not original, but it is still a very powerful demand of the disability community. Luna, what would you spray on Parliament?
I wrote "Burn It All Down" in honor of Harsha Walia, who's someone that I have a lot of respect for, who does a lot of work around liberation and prison justice, and you know that phrase has been going on since last year, and I continue to say it: burn it all down, because disabled people, you know, we can build this thing on our own. These intrusive systems are too much. So that's what I'll say: burn it all down for the third time.
Thank you. So I think if everyone is ready, we can start with our discussion about ableism. And I'm just going to read sort of the introduction, or tell you the introduction of how this topic was chosen as a topic for the filibuster. Because ableism, as Luna has already sort of mentioned, ableism is just deeply embedded into our colonialist society. And it's something that a lot of people know very little to nothing about, including disabled people. So as a society, we carry ableism. It's embedded in the way that we see each other, and that permeates and spreads into all of the decisions that we make, and the way that we interact with each other, the way we care or don't care about each other, how we value lives, and how people experience their disabilities and their lives as disabled people. So today we're going to discuss how ableism affects our everyday lives and our self-worth. And we're going to talk about things like how ableism teaches us to see disability as a tragedy, as something that's tragic, rather than just another way of being a part of the human continuum. We'll talk about the myth of overcoming and how society often expects and demands and requires that people overcome, in quotation marks, their disability. How disabled people are often framed as being burdensome, and how we can assume that into our own sense of ourself, and how that makes us more vulnerable to things like the suggestion of MAID. We'll talk about how disabled people are often required to express gratitude for the provision of their rights, something that everyone else takes for granted, and sort of how that affects us as a disabled community. So I want to say right off at the beginning that we do talk about some very difficult and heavy things, and it might be a challenging conversation because the things we talk about are hard, because sometimes we haven't thought about them before, and sometimes people have a realization of the way that ableism has affected them that they've never had before. And it can be challenging, it can be profound, it can be difficult, but it can also be freeing or enlightening, because many disabled people carry ableism, internalized ableism, and really don't know that it's there, and how much it affects our lives and the way that we live in the world. So I just wanted to start by saying that, and also to say, if you need to take some time and you need to just have a pause, please do that to take care of yourself, because it can be a lot. So the way that we're going to do it, I think what we'll do is we'll just, I'll share a screen and I'll share a slide, and it will have a topic or something that we'll discuss. And I'll introduce the topic, and then we can, Luna will sort of start the conversation about that particular topic, and we'd love to hear what our panelists' thoughts are on each sort of identified. I mean, ableism is pervasive and large, but we've identified several sort of themes that we'll discuss today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then once I've shared the screen, we'll go back to the panelists and we'll have a conversation. Okay, now did that work? I don't think it did it? No, it says, oh, it says the host disabled participant screen sharing, so maybe I can't.
Well, that's
Not
strange.
sure.
Let me double check that 1 second here.
Thank you.
This is where I, as a Virgo, will say, "See, I told you so." On point. No matter how well planned each session is, not just a filibuster, but every session I facilitate, there's always something. There's like a technology god that's like, I'm just going to give you some challenges, as if you don't have enough challenges already.
It's true. It's very true.
Oh.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think the other interpreter is here, but has not yet been promoted to panel, so they can't see anything other than who's speaking. Would you be able to change that for them? So they can turn their camera on and we can switch.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other interpreters here, let me just see.
It'll be either under the name Maple Communications 2 or like his name, which is Matthew.
While we're sorting that out, I just want to say, first of all, that if we can't share the screen for some reason, that doesn't, I mean, we can certainly work around that. So that's okay if it doesn't work for whatever reason, we can just, I can just introduce the topic, and that's not a problem. So the first, maybe I will tell you what the very first slide is about, and it's a definition of ableism. If we're able to share, I'll put it up. But in the meantime, I'm going to read it, and then we can share our thoughts on it. So the definition that I have chosen to share as a definition of ableism is a definition that's written by Talila Lewis, who is a Black disabled activist in the United States. And they have a working definition of ableism that they update from time to time to sort of center it or place it in the context of what's happening in society. So this year's was updated at the beginning of this 2022, and I'll read you the current one that Talila Lewis has written. Ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, their health and wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So I think that is just such a deep and well-rounded definition of ableism. It really speaks to how ableism impacts us in society and society as a whole, and talks about, you know, the way that ableism is connected to colonialism and the idea of productivity and acceptability and normalcy. There are other definitions of ableism, of course. Some of them are very brief, just ableism is defined as the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities. And just the idea of ableism as a way of seeing people differently, of othering people. Before we move on, Luna, that's our first slide. So if you'd like to share any thoughts on that, or if any of our panelists have anything to add before we move on.
So sorry to interrupt. I've just enabled screen sharing. You should be able to show the panels now, or the this PowerPoints now.
Thank you. I'm going to try it right now. Yes. Okay, wonderful.
Spring, do you want to try sharing screen again? So we can sort of look at the definitions.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I see everyday ableism.
So I will send you onto, there we go.
Beautiful.
There's the definition of ableism.
Thank you so much. I don't want to take up a lot of time because I really want to leave room for other people to talk about this. Personally, I only have one thing to say when it comes to the definitions, and that is how exciting it is for me. And I really actually say excited because I'm a language nerd. And what that means is, like, you know, I'm not someone that like thinks about grammar, or I'm not someone that thinks about pronunciation. But I think a lot about how words come by. I think a lot about how things are defined. And one thing I would say that about definitions is that in my work, I do a lot of reviewing of definitions. I think a lot about who defined them. You know, what are the words that were used? Have any of the consultations been used with people about how they would like to be treated? And I will say that oftentimes we don't see that. And so it is so refreshing and so exciting to be able to see folks who are disabled putting definitions for ourselves and not defined by historic colonialism that always are just getting the most able people to try to define disabled people, right? They do it for races, they do it for class, they do it for gender. It's as if, like, I like to say niche marketing of social identities. I'll use that term, that there's this sort of colonial mentality, and I think savior complexes when it comes to definitions, that definitions often do not have the respect and dignity when it comes to uttering. Even in uttering, they're doing such a horrible job at uttering. So that's all I kind of want to say about definitions, because I have just so many feelings every time I look at a piece of policy. I do policy review in my community planning work, and I have a red pen and I'll write the snarkiest remarks about these definitions, because constantly in my head, I don't see myself represented in them. And I think for a lot of disabled folks, that's usually the problem. We don't see ourselves not only properly defined, but we never gave consent to that. So one of the lessons I really want to kind of like share and advise for people is that every time you look at the definition of something, you really question who wrote that. And if it's written by someone that's able, most probably that definition is incorrect. So to say that I love this definition that Talia has, and I'm really interested in hearing what our other panelists have to say about it. So Sunny, Shea, and Ellen, if you want to chime in, you can. I'll just open it up to you.
I'm just going to interject for a moment. Someone's asked if we share the screen with the ableism definition again, so I will do that, but I'll just do it for a moment and we can keep having our conversation. I think if you'd like to, you can speak while I'll just put it up. But you can talk while it's being shared, I think.
Sweet. Yeah. Any of our panelists, do you have a burning thing that you wanted to say to people? Also, just to say, we're not trying to put anyone on the spot. Crip time means that people need time to process. So if you're seeing silence and sort of like our faces just like not knowing what to say, we can be shy, right? And we can be processing things in different ways. So I'm just going to allow that space for folks to chime in. And panelists, I will also make this kind of a little bit easier. If there's nothing that you wanted to talk about, we can also kind of continue on with the conversation, because I'm sure that there's a lot of juicy parts in the next points that you will say something about.
Sure. Yeah, I think I can move to the next slide now if everyone has had the opportunity. And the next slide is the topic of ableism and seeing disability as tragedy. So ableism is about difference, and non-disabled bodies are considered normal and the standard by which we measure each other. Disability is judged as a negative, and disability is often equated with being unhealthy or unhappy. Most non-disabled people think of disability as something that's sad or that's tragic. In fact, over 80% of doctors were surveyed, when doctors were surveyed, over 80% believed that over 80% of doctors believe that being disabled equated with suffering and with a poor quality of life. So this is a deeply held assumption that disabled people are unhappy or aren't living well or have an unpleasant existence. But the problem is that this is just a projection. It's not true. It's a failure to listen to disabled people when we share our experience. In reality, disabled people tell us both just by conversation and personally that we find just as much satisfaction in our lives as others. But it's also been studied, and there's data to back that up, that disabled people as a community, as a population, experience as high or higher a quality of life than non-disabled people. So, of course, becoming disabled through injury or illness can be traumatic, and it does require time to process and to adapt. But thinking of that trauma, a lot of it is as a result of the society that we live in, and the barriers that we know that we'll face and that our families will face, and that stigma and that discrimination that's associated with disability. So the idea of disability as tragic is harmful to us because we can assimilate and assume that projection of disability, but it's also, it assumes that a disabled life is less worth living, and that's where we become concerned about things like MAID. The idea of disability as tragic is harmful because it can be used to deprioritize disabled people in society. Disabled people experience this devaluation in many ways, including when we're othered and we're silenced and we're pitied and we're institutionalized. Really, disability is just another way of being. And it's not inherently tragic. And many folks who are born with a disability live in a world that sees their natural existence, their natural way of being, as something that's sad or tragic. So that is a way that ableism affects all of us in society. And that's just my introduction. I know we have a lot of things to say about this, so I'm going to pass it to Luna for comments, and then to the rest of the panel if you have anything that you'd like to add. And I'll take the screen down so that we can see each other talk.
Yeah, thank you, Spring. I'm actually looking at our panelists to see if they have anything to say first. So maybe I will go last. I definitely have things that I want to say, but yeah, just turning into our panelists. If you want to speak first, we'll love to hear from you. And maybe while you're processing, I can say, I will share something about ableism and pity and about this whole idea of tragicness. And I think that it really strongly ties to, I think, the savior complex, which I like to talk about in terms of savior complex and MAID. One of the things about MAID, when I first came across it, was like, oh, ha, ha, ha. How nice of you to try to save me. How nice of you to try to relieve me from my suffering. But yeah, you wouldn't ask me any more questions about what are the other ways whereby I cannot suffer other than dying. And this is something that is so personal, right? Because throughout my whole life, I have been taught to be ableist. To be ableist about my achievements, to be ableist about my work, about my body, about my mind. And it really takes a lot of work to unpack that. But then when you start unpacking that, one of the things I found out was that there is inherently a very intrusive savior complex that happens at every disability conversation that I've been to, where there's always sort of this focus of like altruism, was this focus of like compassion and kindness and helping people to release suffering. But I think, part of that issue that I think as disabled people that we've always come across is that, yes, you want to include us, but have you ever asked us how we would like to be included? And I think that is something that's constantly missing, whereby when we think about the power structures in colonial structures, they were not built upon permission. They were built upon no consent, upon a lot of violence, a lot of taking, and a lot of assumptions about who they are and who other people are. And so every time I think about disability and thinking about this whole idea of like pitying a disabled person, I think back of how this is so inherent of the colonizing mentality. And I'll keep saying this over and over again today, that colonization mentality is not just something where a country invades a country. It happens between us. It happens between us because we were brought up in a society that focuses and prioritizes competition, and without any sort of added discourse about what competition actually is like for disabled people. We run into a lot of these kinds of like, oh, you know, wow, disability, that must be so hard. Like how many times have we heard from people, you know, when you tell them, finally, you trust them enough to say, I'm disabled. And they are my favorite words. I cannot imagine. Yeah, you cannot imagine. It's exactly what I'm telling you, you know, because so you don't have to imagine it. And that for us, the pity also comes in the forms of policy. It comes in the form of decision-making. It comes in the form of focusing on fixing things. And I really abhor that. We are living in such a fixing culture, but yet every day we're throwing things away. So what fixing culture are we talking about? Like you want to come and fix us, but you don't actually know what that means. You know, it's like someone trying to fix a vacuum cleaner, but they're like, well, for my whole life, I've just used a brush and a pan. So I don't really actually know how to fix you, but I'm going to try because I've been put into a position to do that. So the idea with MADE is that people can look at it as like, yes, in one form, it relieves suffering for certain people. But for the disabled community, that is inherently not true. MADE does not actually relieve suffering for me. You know, a few days ago, I posted a tweet that said, I've been through sexual violence. I've been through racism. I've been through being a solo immigrant. I've been through suicide and all these things, only to now see a bill that is trying to kill me. But that is frustrating.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I'm just going to stop on that because, you know, my emotions will just come up like that so quickly. So I see that Sunny has a hand up, so I'm going to pass it over to Sunny.
Thank you so much, Luna. I guess I just wanted to share a story that happened about a month ago. I was going to Life Labs to get a bunch of blood taken and stuff, and they were really busy that day, but the person who was taking my blood asked me, oh, sorry, I should back up and specify that I am a manual wheelchair user. The phlebotomist asked me, did I get hurt? And I said, no, it's a collagen condition. So then she asked, so you can't run around anymore? And I say, well, I can technically, it's just really not good for me. And then she asked, will it go away? And I say, no, once I hurt something really badly, it's not going to be the way it was before. And then she just looked at me and said, like very sympathetically, and she said, well, miracles happen. And that rubbed me the wrong way for these two major reasons. And the first one is that, you know, a miracle did happen. I have a wheelchair that I can use that will hurt me a lot less than walking or running around. And then the other thing is that how sad a life must people imagine for disabled people, for wheelchair users, that they think the best that can happen to us is if we just wait around for a miracle to happen, when that is, medically speaking, not possible for so many of us. And, you know, if these are the day-to-day interactions we have with people who are in medical services, like if I see this stuff at the labs, if I go to the hospital, I see this from the nurses and doctors and the techs there too. It's really no surprise that, you know, these able-bodied people want to put us down, so to speak, because they just can't imagine that we could be happy the way we are. And I think it's so important because, you know, we have community, we have each other, and sometimes it is leaning on that community to get us through all the other ableist things we have to put up with throughout our day. End comment, thank you.
Thank you, Sunny. Shea, go ahead.
There we go. It's challenging. I think that, you know, as we talk about deconstructing everyday ableism and the construct of disabled people is to be pitied, you can't have that conversation without having really honest conversations with non-disabled people about what they're envisioning and imagining when you say disabled people. In a lot of my consulting work and training, I talk about the concept of, the imagined disabled other versus the reality of who disabled people actually are. Oftentimes when people think about what it means to be disabled, they have this idea that being disabled means it's giving up agency entirely. And we have been conditioned to see from the time we are born that giving up agency is this horrific outcome, that giving up agency is the worst thing that could happen to us. And essentially we see very quickly, we see it in the way that our grandparents start to get treated as they age. We see it in the way that, children who are more disabled than we are in schools get treated and discarded. And very quickly we internalize this message that to not be fully in control of your life is the worst thing that could happen to you. And so we don't ever imagine that the problem actually isn't the disability. The problem is actually the lack of agency. And we create programs that continue to reinforce this narrative that disabled people can't possibly have agency within their lives. I mean, I ran a community service organization for 3 years, dealt with a number of governmental contracts where we're working with taxpayer money to provide programming and supports in the community. Very familiar with the kinds of contracts the governments ask you to sign for them to give you money. Got approved to start direct funding to hire my own attendants in my home and my own PSWs. I looked at the contract. I have never seen that kind of a government contract. And the only reason for that kind of a government contract is that despite the fact that to even get to this stage, you have to pass a competency interview, which is like absurd. And then you have to agree to provide several hours a month of business management services for free and unpaid to then pay people to take care of you at a rate that they then dictate. The only reason to set up anything like this is if you truly believe that they're incapable. But if disabled people are incapable, why are you making them go through a competency interview? And there are so many examples of disabled people coming into conflict with these two different ideas about what it means to be disabled, and that we try to separate out the ways that we serve disabled people with a lack of agency versus disabled people with agency and privilege. And nobody actually ends up getting what they need. And these programs just sit there in ways where, it's clear that nobody has updated this program since the 1980s. And I know that it's clear because instead of having things like centralized bookkeeping software where the administrative burden on the folks managing this is 10 minutes a month to approve the hours that the folks working under you have actually worked, and then everything else gets administered through payroll systems, they still distribute money to a bank account in your name. This is a financial system that hasn't been the standard of a financial system since the early 90s, early 2000s at the absolute latest. And what does it mean when we set up these kinds of programs and forget about them and people get stuck on them for potentially the rest of their life without anybody realizing how deeply they impact people's day-to-day experiences in their homes and how hostile those interactions can become under the wrong circumstances? I'll end my comments here because I see that Spring has some things to add.
Thank you for sharing both of your experiences, and thank you, Shea, for talking about agency. And I have had similar experiences, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that experience of having our abilities to and our agency sort of undermined. We will come to a little bit more about that discussion as we go through the topics. So maybe we should move to the next slide, unless Alan, and you haven't raised your hand, so we'll move to the next slide, which is called Ableism and Belonging. And it talks a little bit more about, you know, the othering of disabled people. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we can have a talk about that. And then I really love that we've shared our personal experiences. I think that's a really powerful way to sort of illustrate the concept or the topic that we have identified as a part of ableism that we want to talk about. So I'll share my screen, and then we can have a talk. So this screen and this topic is called Ableism and Belonging. Ableism creates a separation. Oh, so sorry, I didn't share. There we go. Ableism creates a separation between groups of people. And this is what's known as othering. So it's an us versus them way of thinking about humanity and relationships. And it basically involves looking at other people who we don't see to be like us. We sort of put them in a separate category. Othering is the antonym, really, of belonging. It's the opposite of belonging. Ableism, belonging implies acceptance and inclusion of people, and othering suggests intolerance or exclusion. And I've taken a lot of that from a website called Very Well Mind, because I thought it was just very clearly explained as a way to think about ableism and othering. So interestingly, the concept of disability itself is a Western construct. Many Indigenous cultures don't even recognize disability as a category or an identity. Instead, every member of society is valued for their own specific characteristics and what they bring to the community. In fact, disabled people in some cultures are elevated or respected as oracles or as, you know, wisdom, sources of wisdom, or other have special characteristics that they bring to the community. So ableism is very much, as we've already said, sort of a Western construct, this idea of disability creating a separate category of people. When you think about disability as a separate category, you think about what makes us different rather than what makes us the same. And so as we go through this today, I would love for people to think about stories or things that you might be able to share about that, making how you've been made to feel different in your life, or an example of ableism as expressed as othering. I'll take the screen down, and then we can see each other speak. And Luna, I'll let you start.
Thanks. I actually see Shea's hands up, so I'm actually going to let Shea start.
Yeah, this is Shea speaking. I feel like in so many ways, it's so problematic to even have to have conversation about ableism as belonging in the first place. We look at the census data that gets released, and which we know is underreporting the true incidence of disability in this country, because we know that so many folks are early on in their journey towards understanding what that word means, understanding how that word intersects with their life, such that when the census comes up and says, do you have a disability, even though they have a fairly good and robust definition of what disability means, we know that not everyone who could identify as belonging to that category is on that kind of measure of population. And so we know that even from those who are reporting yes, that we're looking at between 20 to 25% of our population. And so when we're talking about disabled people belonging, can you imagine any other conversation that we're having about belonging where we're talking about a quarter, at a minimum level, a quarter of our population, and trying to talk about whether or not they belong? And yet, how many times do we see events posted where they make no mention of the fact that this is a large in-person gathering? Of course, there are going to, if you're expecting more than 4 people to show up, disabled people are going to be there. And yet we see events where no mention is made of what we need. Or they might say that disabled people are welcome, but that you have to request accommodations and that you cannot participate in the event in the same manner as everyone else can, that there is always a special process for your participation, whether or not that is coming through a separate entrance, whether or not that is having to ask for ASL interpretation or captioning, whether that is, it doesn't matter what that is. And it really, it becomes very limiting. I have a, like, there are, like, my educational background is in child and youth care, and I have graduated with a master's degree about 5 years ago. And 5 years later, I still cannot participate in the professional activities in my profession because they are not fully accessible to me. How am I meant to work a job when they can't even manage to make something accessible on an occasional basis? When they're actually, in fact, afraid of the work that they would have to do to make something accessible. How can we expect the ways in which we practice and shift to change and evolve if we don't make space to have these kinds of conversations? For people to belong, they have to be able to even see that there is an open doorway and an open pathway to having a conversation. And the disabled person is always expected to initiate the conversation, teach the non-disabled people how to do the work, be polite while they fumble it up and mess it up, go even when it doesn't meet their needs, and then be grateful. And if they are not able to fully participate in that cycle, then they have not, fulfilled the social contract that the organizations believe that they're getting into in this benevolent gesture of trying to be inclusive. And when you get told that you don't belong in every single place that you used to belong prior to a disability, where is there left for you to go? Where is there left for you to be? And so much of that, initial, we talk about that a big risk time for folks with MAID is after that initial decline in function, whether that is an accident, whether or not that's a significant flare of a chronic illness, whether or not that's a mental health episode. It's in that time where they can't imagine what a future could be like, where they're stuck in having lost everything that they thought they could depend on. And how are we sending, like, what kind of a message are people sending if you that happens to you and their response is, that's nice, we don't have the budget to do this, you belonged before, but now we don't care enough about you to find a way that you can still continue to participate. And that's devastating. It tells people that their participation was never truly valued in the first place, and you lose community in major ways that are devastating. And when there is no safeguard as to the obligations that people and organizations have to reach back to disabled people or to access those solutions, requires people to go through a court proceeding that we know never actually gets us what we want. What we want is to feel valued. And going to court and winning a victory is not a way of telling us that we were actually ever valued by the institution or the organization.
Shea, I'm just going to interrupt just for a moment. It's because Luna has their hand up. Thank you very much for, those are all such profound observations and such important things to talk about. Luna, did you want to comment on some of the things that Shea shared, or you have, yeah?
I love everything that Shea said. So just a little bit of a preamble, so folks know. So I do a lot of community planning and facilitation and organizing work. And part of that work involves looking at issues of social isolation. And how ironic it is doing this work. And if anyone has ever done any form of organizing for social justice and social equity, the pitfalls of trying to do this work of belonging, of trying to create belonging, whether it's for ourselves or for other people, often involves going down a little bit of a history of finding out how governments and programs and institutions have made you feel and made us feel that we actually don't belong. So you see the irony of that is that when institutions come up to you and say, hey, you know, this is the year of accessibility, this is the year of inclusion, we are officially starting this thing. And then you're like, but what about the last 150 years of disabled folks, including indigenous BIPOC folks, asking you for things that you did not deliver? You know, can we talk a little bit about all the impacts of previous policies and programs that have created drastically the feeling of unbelonging? And also, whose belonging is it, right? And I think a lot about this, especially with the events that have been happening over the last years, things like the Freedom Convoy, things like the rise of white supremacy, right? The constant sort of arguments of the social definition of disability, or the social model versus the personal model. That, you know, like belonging is so tied, it's so tied to place and land. It's so tied to place and land. And I think about how we live on lands that have been destroyed and continue to be destroyed. And we see it in our cities. We see how ableist our cities are built. And I talk to a lot of urban planners a lot of the time, and the conversation that often comes back up is that people always forget disabled people, whether or not they're wheelchair users, whether or not they roll, but consistently disabled peoples are forgotten and intentionally not consulted because people believe that their intentions are good. So what we end up having is actually a built environment or a city environment, or, you know, just going out into public space and finding out that there's a lot of spaces that are not conducive for disabled people even to live. Like, I live in the Mount Pleasant area, and I am a very sensitive person. And every day I have sirens going through my area 24/7. 1 o'clock in the midnight, 2 o'clock, 3 in the morning, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And these, you know, some people may be able to tune them out, but as someone who lives with PTSD as well, it tells me that my city is unsafe. It tells me that the city is not built for me. And what happens with MAID, and I'm not going to pull sort of the relationship to MAID, is that we hear stories of people saying, well, I'm too poor, I cannot afford to go on living, so I'm going to choose death. But then we also forget, in that sort of conversation, there's so much about where we live. Where we live directly impacts our mental health, directly impacts our ability and disabilities. And when a city or a place is not well built, that centers disability, justice, and principles, like, a lot of people will choose MAID very easily. Like, I have been in that situation myself where I felt so socially isolated and having had suicidal tendencies. It's very easy for me to be like, well, the place that I'm living is shit. The life that I'm living is shit. I can do nothing about it. The government doesn't want to do anything about it. What is the point of living? And that is a real thing that happens pretty much almost every day. You know, people say, you know, MAID is only available for us to consider when we grow old or get sick, or like as the last resort. But no, like, for someone that's suicidal, we are like the content creators for like the show 1001 Ways of Dying. Like, there's every day, there's thoughts that go through my head about how to end my life. I don't need a government to tell me, hey, let us help you. But we won't help you with expenses. We will give you a lot of forms. We will make sure you have the A-stellar team before you can apply for this disability benefits. So, you know, thinking about what Shea is saying is that there's a lot of these connections that makes MAID so dangerous, that when we look at MAID in isolation, it makes no sense when you connect it with our built environments, with where we live, how we live. I think I'll end with that, because there's a lot that can be said, and we can be here for 3-4 days easily for this conversation. So I'll end my comments right there. So next for Consigo.
Thank you, Luna. That's really an interesting point that you made about belonging and the connection to land and belonging. I actually hadn't made that connection in my mind before, but it's really, really profound, actually. I thank you very much for all of that, both of you. I'm just going to reframe the question, or ask the question one more time, and just to make sure that we know what we're responding to. And the slide that we've been talking about just now is about ableism and othering, as opposed to the idea of a belonging. So how ableism creates that separation between groups of people, that alienation, or that othering. And Alan, would you like to add to that conversation? Oh, you're on mute still. Sorry. The classic.
Yeah.
There you go.
I thought I pressed unmute, but I guess I didn't. All right, here we go. Yeah, I'll try to say a few things about that. Yeah, I guess in terms of othering, like, I found that when I was younger, it was actually easier to be disabled. Like when I was a youth growing up, like I didn't feel any different. You know, I had lots of friends at school, and they'd come over after school and we'd hang out. And you know, I didn't really know what ableism was when I was a kid. But as I grew older and, you know, learned more about yeah, ableism and how it's you know, part of a lot of different systems and a lot of things we do, and a lot of the attitudes, like, you know, earlier on in my life, if someone made a comment, I would just think, oh, they're rude or ignorant. But like, I've realized it's beyond that. It's like there's reasons people say, make rude comments or ignorant comments, and it's because of how disabled folks are viewed in society and how we're portrayed. And so yeah, it's only been like later in my life that I've actually learned what ableism is. And I think as you grow older and, you know, try to engage in the world more, whether it's through school or higher education, working, whatever it is, I think that's when you start to realize that, you know, you can be sidelined quite often in some of these environments. And I do a lot of community organizing as well in Winnipeg, and there's honestly not a lot of organizing spaces I feel comfortable in, even though, you know, a lot of them are leftist spaces where people think they're very progressively minded. Like, oftentimes I'm the only disabled person in that space, and it can feel very weird and othering. And yeah, so yeah, it's only like, it's been really interesting in terms of how that has evolved. Like I said, when I was younger, I didn't really think much about it. And, you know, when I was a kid, I was just a kid, just like everyone else. And I used a wheelchair, but other than that, I didn't really think about how society would other me. And then, yeah, like I just found, like, once I was in my teens, early adulthood, like that's when I started to realize, you know, things are going to be different for me. Like my life's going to be different. And yeah, and then, you know, I learned why that is. And, you know, you can basically pin all of it back on ableism. And yeah, how how in the insidiousness of it in many of the different systems we're forced to engage in our society. And yeah, I'm not sure how to wrap up my thoughts on this, but yeah, maybe I'll just end comment there.
Sure, no, thank you. And we don't need any clean, tidy wrap-ups, because we'll still moving the conversation along. So thank you, Alan, for that insight. I think we'll move to the topic of ableism and interdependence, and sort of in a colonial society which places the highest value on independence. I'll share the slide just for a moment. The slide is I chose it because it's a picture of a father who uses a wheelchair, and he's got his baby in a special wheelchair stroller. And I chose it because so often disabled people are framed as the receivers of care. They're sort of we receive care and other people care for us. And there's this horror around any sort of dependence on others. I mean, I don't know how many of you listened to the Senate or the committee hearings over the last few weeks, but people are expressing the fact that they believe genuinely that it's worse to require care for their bodies or their minds than it is to be alive. Quite literally, people have said, if I need to have someone help me go to the bathroom, I'd rather be dead. Well, I have personal care. Someone helps me do all of those very intimate things to help my body stay alive so that I can be here. And I just, I would like to tell those people who are voicing support for MAID because they believe they would find it preferable than to be dependent on someone else. That you can be alive and you can be well and you can be happy, even when you need help to survive. And the fact is that this idea of becoming interdependent is somehow the most terrible thing that can happen to you is such a it's such a denial of the fact that we all need each other to be alive. None of us, doesn't matter whether we're disabled or not, can live and survive alone. We are a society that works together to provide services to each other, whatever those services might be. We are all interconnected and we all need each other to survive. And it's one of these concepts, that I think as a colonial society, we've lost sight of the way of being of many Indigenous cultures, where there was an acknowledgement and appreciation and evaluation of our interdependence, and the fact that we are not individuals, we are reliant on each other. So I just, as a start to the conversation, your observations, your thoughts, your life experiences, things that you have observed around the idea of ableism and interdependence versus dependence. I don't know, it may be Luna.
Yeah.
Like to start that?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Spring. This is a topic that I have had many trajectories when thinking about dependency and interdependence. That directly actually ties to my own experience of growing up, part of the Asian diaspora, and it's a cultural thing as well, and how it sort of engages in sort of the Western ideas of individualism. That is so interesting for me because, I come from a culture whereby parents tend to live with their kids until they get married. And even after they get married, families will do things for each other, right? You're always taking care of each other. Friends and community would take care of you. And I remember, so I first came here in 2001. And one of the biggest cultural shocks that I've ever had was meeting people who said that, oh yeah, my parents kicked me out of the house when I was 21, or they kicked me out of the house when I was 16. But you also hear that from disabled people too, especially folks who live with sort of non-physical disabilities. A lot of autistic folks that I've heard have gone through this sort of reflection as I did about how is care being accessed when we live here in a society that promotes capitalism, that promotes a hyper working culture, and that the individual time that you have left is up to you to go and do more work to improve yourself so that you can show up to work tomorrow. So I'm going to kind of tie this sort of interdependence and independence conversation to our culture of working endlessly, of needing to perform endlessly, and needing to, you know, be the most ableist person as much as possible. Because I think that that's where our lines of this sort of perspective of being dependent or not dependent really comes from. It's very transactional. And I'll say it's like, I'll give an example of a saying of that. I have to pay to receive care. I have to pay to give care. And they're both true. However, we're so normalized now to use transactional languages when we talk about dependencies. It's, you know, one for one. If I give you a plate of food, you give me a plate of food, you know, and if you can't, then you're not meeting your parts of the agreement. So I think that there's this sort of hyper equalization I really dislike this. All of us are born equal is one of the things that I really dislike most, because that is never the truth. The ways that equality have been drilled into us comes from the colonial capitalistic idea of what equal means. It's not our definition of equality. It is the ableist folks' definition of equality. And their definition is, you do not look like me, you do not act like me, you do not accomplish like me, hence it is my responsibility, because the strong always have to save the weak, to be nice, be kind, and to do everything in my power to lift you up. The phrase, to lift you up, not meet you where you are, so that we can be on equal grounds. And that is the biggest fallacy that I think exists when it comes to talking about burdens. That we don't come from a culture of recognizing that burdens is a part of life and burdens is not inherently bad. If we go somewhere, if we travel, we bring our suitcases, right? We don't say that this is a burden. Like, we don't go around to say, you know, I don't go around traveling going like, I'm so sorry, I'm just carrying my burden with me right now. You know, as a disabled person, I have to carry this burden. I'm so glad you don't have any burdens. So I think that that dependency question really comes back to us, again, going back into our mentalities, the savior complexes, the need to slow down time, which is where I'm so grateful for Crip time. Because I get so heartbroken when I hear people say, I rather choose to die rather than be a burden to my family members. But what we don't say is that, oh, I do not want them to take time off work to come and take care of me. And how much of that is focused around work? How much of that is focused around doing and achieving things? We think that if we are disabled, we are burdened from holding people back to accomplish their best selves. But no one ever thinks about when you can talk to someone with a disability, someone who's disabled, you are doing the same thing. You are doing the same thing. You don't have to go out to achieve and perform. We don't need to perform this thing. Taking care of people is not performative. It is a part of life. And we all go into life knowing that we will die. So the best thing that we can do is to help each other die in the ways that we want to die, not be forced to die, if that makes any sense. Anyways, I'll end my comments there.
Thanks, Luna. And I just want to, we had a comment from someone who's participating, who just said that they wanted to emphasize the point that you made about care not being transactional. So you've been heard, and I think it's a really important point for people to take away, that care is, it should be the way that we are and the way that we live and the way that we do things, as opposed to becoming this giving and receiving interaction or transaction. Does anyone else have anything they would like to add to this conversation about interdependence and dependence? there's so much to be said, but also I'm aware that we do have quite a few more topics. So I don't know if we want to try to get through all of them, or we can spend more time on some. That's okay too. So if, I'm just inviting anyone who would like to add to this conversation. Shea, I see your hands up. Oh, sorry, Alan.
Oh, go ahead. I think Shea got in there first.
Okay, I just noticed your hand up, Shea.
Sure, I can talk. I was just gonna say that, like, I think that as a society too, we have pretty poor understanding of what care means, and that there are certain types of care that are seen as more legitimate than others. But the interesting thing that is really profound about that is that, like, there are beautiful moments in care. If you actually look at what care is, do you treat it as it's something clinical? And I think that this is what so many disabled people are so quick to point out, that non-disabled people who haven't had that experience really struggle with wrapping their heads around, right? Is that, like, care doesn't have to be clinical. Care can be held deeply within relationship. Care can be sexy, care can be fun, care can be flirty. Lori Erickson, so much of her, I think they go by they, them pronouns, so much of their work is about, like, all of the ways that care doesn't have to be this clinical hospital thing, and that for so many disabled people, the demoralizing thing is not that we require care, it is how clinical and how removed from us as humans that care actually is. And that when we have the agency to have care that feels good for us in our lives, that's no different from a relationship with a spouse who you depend on, or a partner who you depend on, or a friend who you talk to. And all of these ways that care is already normalized and provided in our society. This doesn't have to be any different than that, you know? How many people like an errand buddy to go around and do things with them? Well, if you're disabled, you can have an errand buddy, great. Like, why does this have to be so complicated? It's really not that different. That's the end of my thought.
Thank you very much, Shea. Alan, you were going to say something.
I'll just make a quick comment so we can get to the other topics. I think in terms of, like, independence and interdependence, I think as disabled people, we're forced to prove that we can be independent, and, like, that's somehow the pinnacle of functioning in society. And it's drilled into us through things like the independent living movement, which has maybe had its place at one point, but I think there's some things that can definitely be interrogated about it. And even, like, I used to work at a disability organization, and someone the executive director asked me if I receive home care, and I'm like, no, for now I can do my activities of daily living on my own. And he's like, oh, that's great, good for you. I'm like, well, there's no shame in it if I did need home care. Like, what are you trying to say here? So, like, those attitudes even persist even in the organizations that are supposed to be working for us and representing us. So, end comment.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that, because it is such an ingrained belief that you actually touched on the next topic, which is exactly that, ableism and overcoming, and this great weight and importance on somehow overcoming your disability, and the failure that's associated with it if you don't, that you're somehow a person who hasn't tried hard enough, or you're that's such a good point. And thank you for saying that and pointing it out to people, that there's nothing inherently a failure if you do actually need I'm going to share quickly a personal experience. I'm a quadriplegic, and when I was in the hospital recovering from my injury. There were many paraplegics, and many, if you're a paraplegic, often you are able to go home and to provide your own care, and you don't need someone else coming to help you. And that was always really seen as the pinnacle of success. You know, the height of your recovery was your independence, and that's just not a reality for people. I will never be an independent. I will always require care. And that's directly related to my type of disability. And it was a really hard thing for me to tackle in my emotional sort of reconciling with my injury and my disability, because it really did feel like I wasn't trying hard enough. I was failing somehow at my recovery because I would need care. I would need help. And that's so harmful. It's so harmful for people with disabilities, for disabled people. So I'll move to the next slide. I'll just share the screen, and I have I've titled it Ableism and Overcoming, and I have a quote from Stella Young. If you don't know who Stella Young is, she was I think she was a comedian, and if she wasn't, she should have been, because she was quite funny. But she spoke about disability, and she has, you know, she's quite well known and in disability groups. And her famous quote is, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." And we hear that all the time. And she says, the reason that's bullshit is because it's just not true. So that's the quote I have on the slide. And what I can sort of speak to say to that is, because society sees disability as a tragedy, we demand disabled people overcome their disability. And we've all heard it. She won't let her disability stop her. This person didn't let his disability stop him, and he, you know, went mountain climbing, or he went on a 3-week trek, or whatever the things are that this person did. There's a longer quote from Stella Young that this original quote is pulled from, and what she said is, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude." That quote makes no sense, because the reason it's just not true is because of the social model of disability. We know that no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. Never. Smiling at a television screen isn't going to make the closed captions appear for people who are deaf. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshop and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille. It's just not going to happen. So often I think that this idea of overcoming is sort of it's a 2-part ableism. And one of the parts is that as disabled people, we're sort of seen to be failures, or to have not tried hard enough, or to be whatever sort of horrible description that is put upon us, you know, lazy or unmotivated, or any of those things. But the other part of it is, if we try hard enough and we manage to overcome or minimize or hide our disability, it creates comfort for people around us. It creates, it displaces whatever the discomfort is that able-bodied people feel around disabled people. It minimizes it, it makes it smaller. And that is one of the reasons that it is such a powerful thing and such a pervasive thing, is that discomfort, and that the burden is placed on us, the responsibility is placed on us to make things more comfortable by playing down our disability, by sharing it less, by hiding it, by disregarding it, pretending it's not there. So those are my thoughts, my initial comments on that. It's connected to the idea of failure. And I do have some thoughts about that, but I think we'll just we'll pass it on to the panel and we can let Luna start again.
Thanks for letting me start every time.
Well, you're my co-host.
Yeah, you know, I really, every single topic that we're talking here, there's so many threads to it. And I think that for this sort of like overcoming conversation, you know, okay, so let's tie this back to MAID for a second. So the waiting period for MAID is 90 days, right? If you've requested it. So instead of my reflections, and I've been going through literature on Bill C7 also over the last couple of days just to get myself even more familiarized. And one of the things and one of the questions that I've had continues to be, how is 90 days going to help me overcome, even if I'm set on overcoming them, when there are no structures and supports around to help me do that? That's often my simplest question also when it comes to learning about what gets built in our towns and cities. You know, what are the programs and policies that are considering our lives and Crip time? And I find that there's a sense of shame that sits very deeply in us when we are not fast enough for people. Like, you know, when you deal with like ableism, it's always about like, we're not fast enough for people. When you deal with application forms, we're not fast enough for government. And they like to say, well, we've given you 3 months. Is that not enough? And you say, well, that's not really enough. I need more time. And they say, well, like what Shea said before, we don't have the resources to give you more time. So now then the question is it my fault then? Because you have said that you want to come help me, but you're not really giving me a fair, or even consult with me, what's a fair way of doing this? So I got really frustrated because, you know, thinking about 3 months, how able people, the most able people, like gym instructors, you know, people who are hyper athletic, they will say it takes 90 days to change your habits. But yet here you are, you're telling me that I have 90 days to plan my own death. Do you know what the difference is between changing a habit and overcoming life's difficulties that were created by colonialist thinking, that had created segregation, that had created othering? You want me to have 3 months to think in my head how I'm going to overcome all of these. And yet, you know, after 3 months, I get to go through the procedure with no questions asked. And, you know, what if on my very last day, I just like, actually, you know what though, for this to really work, I would like for the government to return back all the land to indigenous peoples. And then we'll talk. Because we know how that thread goes, right? Colonization happens first. You create all the colonizing structures, and then you just keeps feeding on and on and on and on. So what we get all the time is not about overcoming our disability. It's about overcoming the perception and structures whereby those disability or these disabling issues and situations become real for us. Like I shouldn't have to, you know, put more time, energy, and money and resources to trying to solve this for able people. And like you said, Spring, sometimes I feel like we exist just so that we can, or like not we can, but just so that able people can be like, oh, you know, I feel good about myself. And that happens all the time, right?
Inspiration porn, yeah.
Our disability is being used for them to calm the shame down, the shame of maybe one day having to depend on someone, right? That's why people have also do eugenics. That's why people have like designer babies. So they will never have a disabled baby. So let's talk about that. What is that mentality? What is that mindset? Where does it come from? It comes from everything that we know. The whole idea of overcoming things is so steep into making sure that you have someone to utter so that you feel good about yourself. And that is wrong. You know, Like I will overcome my own issues, things, but stop making things harder for me. And that is the message I want to get across to folks who support MAID, is that we're not trying to, like, I'm not trying to say that MAID, is in, how do I say this? Like, what I'm trying to say is that MAID doesn't solve everything. It's an easy out. It doesn't solve everything. We can have 1,000 people signing up for MAID tomorrow, and they go, and governments, they will not change a single thing about their work. So we don't need that. And I'm just going to stop there and end comment.
Yeah, it's so deep. It's so just challenging and deep.
Sorry.
Thank you, Luna. Does anyone else, I'm sure you all have things that you're thinking, so does anyone have anything that you'd like to share about this idea of overcoming, of failure, and related to that, we haven't really said the word, is the idea of burden, that if you don't overcome, you failed and now you've become a burden. And so, yeah, that's all tied up in it, right? So would anybody like to speak to that? Alan, do you have anything that you'd like to add? Or Sunny? Shay's hand is up too. Oh, sorry, Shay, I just noticed. Sunny, you can go after Shay. Okay.
I would just add too that when we're having conversations about overcoming or disabled people who are high performing, what we're not ever doing is unpacking the inequitable access to resources that those folks have access to that allows them to move differently in an ableist world, to be able to do something that not every disabled person has access to. Certainly, we know how many disabled people are stuck in inappropriate mobility devices. How many phenomenal disabled dancers are we missing out on because they're being gate-kept away from things that would allow them to actually be able to move in their bodies and to, explore and be in their bodies and do fantastic, phenomenal things. We live in a society that encourages people to be quiet about the pain that they experience or the downtime or the recovery time that they need. I often talk about that if I have to be functional, a lot of my income is from giving workshops and trainings to folks. If I have to be functional at a particular day for a particular window, I might need half of a month to recover. If it's during a bad flare time, it might take me a week or 2 weeks to be able to do any work, to be able to guarantee that I can be functional for a 4-hour window, and the number of supports that I have to bring in to do that, that I am privileged enough to have in my life to be able to do and organize my life in that way. But, 5-6 years ago, before I built up the kind of security that allows me to do that, that certainly would not have been possible. And it's a pretty miserable time knowing that, you're capable of doing something. You want to do the thing, but the supports that you need to be able to do that appropriately are not in place. And it's so frustrating. And it really, because you feel like you have failed when it is not your own personal failing. It is a failing of the system to be there to support you. And it's, consistently bringing the conversation back to people thrive when they have the supports that they need to thrive. If they are not thriving, and if they appear to be if people appear to be overcoming, you're probably invisibilizing the supports that they needed to get there. And if people are not thriving, you are probably blaming them for a failure that is not located within them. And I think that that's the nice way to sum up my thoughts. End of that.
Great, thank you, Shay. We'll let Sunny, or ask Sunny for your input, and then what we'll do once Sunny has spoken is we'll move to the last topic and the last slide, because we have about 10 minutes left in this conversation before we get to the end of the filibuster. It flew by. I can't believe it's almost over. So Sunny, please, we would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to bring a bit of this back to the colonialism that Luna was talking about, and specifically the kind of colonialism that is upheld by immigration policies and the way that we as immigrants can also contribute to immigrant settler colonialism. And what I wanted to say is that if you want to immigrate into Canada, you cannot be a burden on the country. They will not let you immigrate into here if you are too disabled to work, because then you are a burden on Canada's medical system, and we all know how well that functions. But it's really deeply horrible to have this sort of legislated burden put upon immigrants who are disabled. And there's people like myself who sort of immigrated, got citizenship before we get disabled. And so I guess I just bring up all of these structures to remind myself and everyone that like ableism and the concept of disabled people as a burden is so deeply rooted, so deeply entrenched in all of these systems that devalue us, that settle and steal land from Indigenous people, and that displace people in other countries because, you know, as a Western power, we kind of do mess things up for the people all around us. Sorry to end this thought on such a bleak note, but yes, end comment, thank you.
No, don't apologize. It's really, really true. Thank you, Sunny. We have about 10 minutes, just a little under 10 minutes left. So I think the way that we can sort of connect all of these pieces that we've talked about and then connect them sort of in a final or sort of a big way to the idea of MADE and the reason that we're here all together today is to talk a little bit more about, you know, ableism, and when we see disability as a burden, that disabled people are expected to comply. We're expected to be thankful for, you know, our basic needs, having our basic needs met. I'm going to share the screen. There's a lot of backstory to this particular picture that we don't really have time to get into, but you'll see when I show you what it is this carefully composed photo that was it was the cover photo for an article recently about the burden that disabled men are to their wives. Literally, that was what the story was about. And we don't have time to go into all of it, but there's a quote on the slide, and this is a quote from me, and it says, "Disabled people are taught from the onset of their disability that they are burdens to non-disabled people. They are not entitled to the same anything as able-bodied people, and that if they are difficult in any way, they will be abandoned." And, you know, as a disabled person with experience, 16 years of experience being disabled, I have many, many stories that I could share that sort of reflect and reinforce this idea. And it's sad and difficult and, you know, terrible, but in the context of MADE, it's really dangerous because disabled people are literally taught that we need to comply, we need to be agreeable, we need to be nice. You know, we've heard that story of, you know, being a nice Crip or a good Crip as opposed to a not good Crip. We're taught that right from the very beginning. And that's something that I don't think is widely, I know is not acknowledged in society. And when we think about it in the context of MADE, all of the things that we've been taught in our disabled lives leads us to agree. We have been trained to do what we are asked or told to do and to be grateful for it. So when a doctor tells me, as I am recovering from my injury, that I will be, this is, probably not the best illustration. When we have that internalized sense of being a burden, of having guilt about not overcoming our disability, about how difficult and burdensome we'll be to our families, combined with the idea that we need to be compliant and we need to, and it's not just an idea, it actually is true. We actually are required to comply, because if we are difficult, there are hundreds of stories of people not having their needs met or having their supports withdrawn because they've been framed or described as difficult or challenging. It's just so dangerous in the context of MAID, and I'm not wrapping it up very well, but I'm going to pass it on to you because we have 5 minutes left, and it's probably the most important point of the entire broadcast. So I want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak to it. And then at 1:55, we need to take a quick, we need to step away because we need to wrap it up and have a few ceremonial moments. So who would like to start?
I can go again, just only because I really want to read this comments that was in the Q&A, that I think it's the reason why we're here. And this comment is from Kaylee. And Kaylee said, "This is so important. This session on ableism, dependence, interdependence is dismantling some of the reasons I've requested MAID in real time." I don't want to give space to their comments because I'm really going to get emotional talking about this. This is the reason why we do this, right? This is more than MAID. This is about our lives. And this is something that is so deeply personal. And, when I was asked to come in and speak to this, I was really, really frightened also and nervous, because it's always scary to talk about disability, right? And everyone that has worked so hard on this filibuster, so much more than me. For me, that comment is the reason why we spent and shared all this time together, just so that folks know that you're not a burden. Know that the idea of a burden is not inherent within. We're not born with this. We were born to be living our lives in safe ways, in supportive and joyful, caring ways. And I feel oh my goodness, I feel so deeply touched by your comments, Kaylee. I think it's going to sit with me for a while, that I think that we need to do more of these things, because so many people out there blame themselves. So many disabled people blame ourselves for our life, for our death, for every single choice that we make. And at the end of the day, what we all want to hear is that we would love to be loved, taken care of, and we be able to do that with other people. So I really think that comment, I feel that I can feel it in my body right now as my heart just kind of sink down. I can feel all the words that I want to say, but all the emotions that I cannot. It's just in here. So that comment ignited something inside me right now that I'm holding. And yeah, I want to continue to tell folks who are on the call, you are not a burden. If anything, you are your most desirable, pleasurable, wonderful, loving, joyful, caring. I want to squish yourself. you are here. As I said in the beginning, we are here. And I think that that's the spirit we need to continue to go on to, is remembering that we are not dealing with this in isolation. Yes, we might be experiencing that in our bodies, but outside of our bodies, there's so many more things to do that can be done other than made. So for those who are, I'm just going to do a very heartfelt thing. If you have been considering MAID, I hope you rethink. I hope that you have a little bit more information after the filibuster to reconsider your decisions, you know. And I'll just end comments there. It's very, very emotional, and I'm very grateful for this. End comments.
Thanks, Luna. And thanks for reading that. Yeah, that's why we're here, like you said. I think we need to move right to the memorial part of our panelists, our panel. And just taking a moment to think of the disabled people that have been lost. I think Luna has a thought to share about that, and then we'll have a moment of silence. And then I think this ends in exactly 4 minutes, and I think that's kind of just the way it is, so we need to wrap it by then. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Spring. First of all, thank you to everyone who's joined on the call, to our panelists, to Maple Communications for interpreting, and to our tech folks who's doing everything behind the scenes. We wanted to leave a little space for this part of the session, primarily because talking about disability is really, really hard. Talking about MAID is even harder. And I don't know about you, but I have gone through a lot of waves of emotions. And in my culture, in my ancestry self, I'm considered someone who is a grief walker. One of the things that I do is to hold grief with people. And so in acknowledgement of this filibuster, right, this has been a lot of work, and it continues to be a lot of work. And in that work itself, we find ourselves moving along the waves of emotions, moving along, you know, against all kinds of barriers and all kinds of, to talk about overcoming, right? The overcoming that we have to do in order to live takes a lot of toll on us. And so I would love to invite everyone for a moment of silence to remember folks who have passed, folks who have fought, folks who have succumbed, unfortunately, folks who are still here, but really remembering the folks that have put so much of their voice and their wisdom and their experience just so that we can be here today. Spring, I'm not sure if there was a list of names to be read. Did you know? Do we have a list of names? Okay.
And I think we probably should just take a moment to think about those people that we are aware of that we've lost.
So why don't we do this? Let's close our eyes for a minute in silence and think of the folks that you want to remember. And also, I want to invite you to think of a moment of futurisms as well, a place where disabled people belong, where what that means for you, you know. So let's take a moment of silence now. You can close your eyes if you want.
Thank you. And thank you, just before we end, I just want to say thank you to our panelists for coming and for being a part of this thank you very much for being a part of the community and of being so thoughtful and wise. Thank you to Gabrielle and Catherine for organizing Disability Filibuster. Thank you, Luna, for being an excellent co-host. Thank you to the interpreters. And I just want to send you away with that love from the community. And we need to continue this work. Looks like the meeting is not going to end automatically. So I would love to invite Sunny. Would you like to just say a few last words?
Oh my goodness. I'm drawing a blank right now. Sorry, can I pass it to anyone else?
Of course. Alan, would you like to say anything?
I would just like to thank the other panelists for being here and being in a heavy space, and hope you all do something to take care of yourself after this. And yeah, thanks to Spring and Luna, Maple, Gabrielle, Catherine, and all the attendees as well. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, and Gabrielle's just letting me know that our captioners will have to leave. So if we just want to have a very quick Shea and Luna, or maybe Shea, I guess Luna sort of spoke. No? Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.